Welcome back, folks, and today we are going to jump into the ego structure for the Enneagram Type One, also known as the Improver, or as I like to call them, the BMW of ego consciousness, because they're precision engineered, but they require a fair bit of maintenance. And all this content is coming from my new book, Taming Your Money Monster, 9 Paths to Money Mastery with the Enneagram, which you can now pre-order on Amazon. So check it out if you like this content. And also, if you still don't know your Enneagram type, you can follow this QR code to the IEVQ9 Enneagram test, which I happen to like and recommend. I also get a nice kickback if you use it, so please like and share that as well. And as always, if you do enjoy this content, like, subscribe, and share to this YouTube channel. Now, when we look at the ego map for the Enneagram Type 1, we're going to start. Let's just do a quick overview. I'm not going to go too depth into each of these individual concepts because those are covered in other videos, but I want to kind of apply them to the Type 1. And if we're looking at the left-hand side of this graph here, you see the new double cone Enneagram, which is the new model I've developed to explain how and why the Enneagram works. And in doing so, I will have changed some of the classical terminology to certain terms, but I'll have the old terms written alongside there. You can see, so if you can follow along if you already are familiar with the Enneagram. But as we're moving through this ego map, we want to look at the overall sort of meta map that all of us are called to go through over the course of our lifetime. And starting at the bottom, we're starting again in the womb in unconscious unity. We're kind of at oceanic bliss with our environment. And then we pop out, our ego grows, our shadow grows, and it's necessary. And that's our first half of life where we establish our interdependence from our caregivers, from our siblings, from the rest of the world. And it's our path from thee to me, the sacred origin, whatever you want to call it, into your individual self. But then over time, our ego inflates a little too much. It gets so strong that it tends to cause problems. Like our ego isn't bad, but it's trying to, which we'll get into, is trying to help us outrun our greatest fear in childhood, and which I'll explain that for Type 1, which is that for you, though, it's that fear of being bad or defective. And then what happens is that ego kind of pushes away other people. It creates all kinds of car wrecks in our life. Things fall apart. Kind of the midlife crisis is a hallmark for that sort of dark night of the soul that some of us go through. Also, external trauma and tragedy can throw us into it, and we use our ego to try to defend ourselves against these slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, and yet that tends to push other people away as well. And over time, it can even push away our sense of connection to the sacred and the divine, and we feel alone and powerless in an empty and meaningless universe, and that's why we call it the dark night of the soul. But anyway, then over time you crack open and you move, if you allow it. Now, not everyone moves into the second half of life, unfortunately. Many of us kind of just regress back down into our shadow and keep doing the same old things over and over again, which is, Einstein's definition of insanity, and expecting different results. But if we allow that suffering to crack open our ego, we soften, we gain wisdom, we gain some maturity, maybe a little more compassion for ourselves and for others, for the mistakes of life, and then we're moving into a deeper sense of interdependence. Of course, this is drawn as a linear model. It's never a linear process. We can go back and forth on this more times in a day than we change our mind about lunch. But we want to try to live more up in the higher level of our ego structure as much as possible. And if the highest peak would be a lightning awakening, that conscious unity, that now we're able to be self-aware, but we're also aware not just of our individualism and our own needs and wants, but our interconnection with everyone and everything and everywhere, and that love and unity that binds us all together. Okay, so let's jump into the shadow structure for the one. If you're a Type 1, think about your darkest emotional moments, where when you feel at your worst, you probably feel anger more than any of the other emotions, because your sacred wound internalized an anger towards yourself when you don't do things quite right, when you aren't living up to some high standard of this. You maybe have a very strong inner moral code, a sense of ethics, which is great. Not that we want that. But for the one, it's a little bit on hyperdrive. And so you have this perfectionistic tendency to criticize yourself, or criticize others, or criticize the wider world, and sometimes all three in different combinations. And that actually has to do with your instinctual variance stack, which of those three you prefer, but they're all present. All three of those are present in Type 1s. whether you want to direct it mostly at yourself, which is most common for the one. Some ones will direct it towards others more than themselves, and then some will direct it more towards systemic issues and systems. Those are the kind of three ways this perfectionistic behavior can manifest itself. But it's stemming from that greatest fear that things are going wrong, that things are imperfect, that you're imperfect, and you want to kind of improve that so you don't trigger that great fear. And we then develop your greatest vice, which is also anger, but different from your sacred wound of internalized anger. What I mean by anger for your greatest vice, sometimes called your passion, that's the older terminology for this term, is that the anger is what gets triggered when you don't live up to your perfectionistic standards. When you catch yourself going 70 miles an hour in a 65 mile an hour zone, and you're like, oh my God, I'm doing something horribly wrong, I got to slow down. And all this guilt comes up, and shame and other things can arise, or you get mad, but that you've somehow broken this code that you feel is so important. And I'm talking about speeding tickets, but it could be any sort of boundaries that we set on ourselves and the reality sets on ourselves for prudent behavior. And so this inner drill sergeant in you is always telling you to shape up and do better. And that drill sergeant is an angry voice that you don't want yelling at you. And that's, again, the motivation and driver. But all of that is really buried in your unconscious mind. It's hard to even see it until you learn about the Enneagram or someone points it out to you, because your shadow is a sneaky creature, right? But you don't want to feel that anger. And so one of the ways you justify that anger, the way you make what's fundamentally a negative characteristic trait, which we all have this. It's not, I'm just poking on the ones here, but it manifests for you in a particular way, which is as resentment. So when you get resentful towards yourself and just frustrated, or mostly you get resentful at others when they aren't doing things the right way, right? Then that resentment can feel it can justify the anger. It allows you to feel vindicated or validated for all the things that aren't going right. And so in a way, you're taking what's a negative, making it in a weird way feel or seem like a positive. But again, it's trying to keep your greatest fear at bay. It's a defense mechanism to keep that sense of being bad or defective from becoming your reality. But the problem, of course, is that over time, your primary ego addiction will create the very problem you're trying to avoid. So if you're trying to avoid being a bad person as a one, and you're walking around being resentful and angry all the time, well, that's kind of the definition of not being a very good person in some respects. And now you might have other parts of your life that are going in good shape, but in this one, you might need to do some work. And so, but when that resentment builds up and it becomes kind of either a dangerous level, a toxic level, or you have a problem that your resentment and anger aren't going to solve because your resentment and anger probably caused the issue, then your ego has this unconscious flip. It kind of flips the script on you in a heartbeat. You're not even aware it's happening, but you have a secondary ego addiction when you get really stressed out, when you find yourself in times of crisis or overwhelm or whatever, then and your resentment and anger can't bust through that. You have this secondary ego addiction, which creates the opposite or inverse negative behavior of your primary ego addiction. And it does it in a kind of a complicated way. So you get to follow the inner physics or inner logic, if you will, of how your shadow structure works. And the way it does is you then shift to your secondary ego addiction, which is melancholy. And now melancholy is the primary ego addiction for a type 4. And so you begin to behave and look a little bit like an individualist type 4, where wallowing in the land of sorrow is an Olympic sport and sighing is the national pastime. There you end up in that melancholy, then it combines with your greatest vice of anger. So that greatest vice isn't going away, and that's why you're not changing your type. But the anger is mixing with that melancholy. So there's this anger at the world, and then there's this melancholy about how awful things are, and that creates sorrow. And sorrow is your ego stress response. That's really the antithesis to resentment. And it's sort of, and what I mean by that, it's like a fire extinguisher to all that resentment. It makes you feel more pity for yourself at times a pity for the world, but in a that weird melancholy for self-indulgent way. It isn't necessarily a loving pity; it's more of a chastising pity. But that sorrow then allows a little more self-indulgent behavior to come out. It allows you to let go so much of your rigid control of trying to fix things and kind of let things be, but doing it in a dysfunctional way in some sense. But that sorrow makes you retreat back into yourself, and you're not going to feel good. You obviously, it's not a pleasant place to be, but it's like if your resentment is like a stimulant, then sorrow is like a depressant. And so those two things work in opposite ways to sort of balance each other out in your shadow structure. Now, there's a healthier response that you could have, of course, and that's in your enlightenment structure, which we'll get to in just a moment. But then that leads us into the money monsters for the type 1, which are the Prude and the Pious. And just to review, the Prude is what that means for type 1 is, since this is if when you're being, I should circle back, and we have another video, of course, on the attachment theory of money, which I'll explain very quickly here. The idea is that when we have an unhealthy relationship to money, we can it can manifest in a similar way to our attachment style in our romantic relationships, meaning like we can be anxiously attached to our romantic partners, or we can be avoidant and more distant of them. And that same relationship style is often present in how we deal with money when we're in our worst, unhealthiest states. And so for an avoidant prude, that's someone who pushes money away, who rejects, doesn't want to engage with it, hates dealing with money at any level. It manifests for one in a very specific kind of clever twist of moral logic. So the one doesn't want to be bad at doing anything. They don't want to appear bad or defective or corrupt in the eyes of this inner critic. And if they're not financially literate, if they aren't doing maybe as well as they could or should be in their financial life, for whatever reason, or they misinterpreted some of the religious restrictions around money in a way, and they've decided that instead of being mad at themselves for being bad with money, they make money the bad thing instead. So if money is bad, then the perfect way to deal with something that's bad or evil or corrupting is to have nothing to do with it, is to reject it, to push it away. Because otherwise, every time an avoidant one opened their wallet or started dealing with their finances, and they realize, well, I'm bad at this, that's the thing they don't want to feel. So they say this thing is bad, and so by my not doing it, dealing with it in the deepest level is the good response. So it's like they put their money in a chastity belt and treat put their wallet in a chastity belt and treat money like it's the devil's pocket lint. And then they get very prudish and uptight, particularly looking down on people who might be more engaged with their finances in a healthier space, or they can demonize the entire world of finance or the entire economic system. And finding flaws in all those things is very doable because there's many things to get mad about our economic system about, but just focusing on the negatives all the time and thinking, well, that's why I don't have to put any effort into this thing is actually an ego trap for the one. It's your avoidant money monster coming out and trying to justify what is essentially, not the healthiest response to finances. And again, to recap, there's 4 pillars of finance. So there's earning, saving, investing, and giving. So earning, saving, investing, giving, you can be anxious in one area and you can also be avoidant in another. So you might be, very much a prude in one respect, maybe around, say, investing money, but you might actually be maybe a little pious around giving money. Those things can happen. And what I mean by the pious, let's jump to the pious, which is the money anxious type 1. So a 1 needs to feel good about everything they do. So then if they're really engaged with their finances, then money is good, okay? But then anyone who is bad at dealing with money is then therefore bad, which is logically incorrect. Or people who make mistakes with money, or if they make a mistake with money, that makes them bad, or makes the person who's who's committed the error somehow morally defective in some way. So, a bounce check for a 1 isn't just a mistake. It's almost a violation of a moral purity code. And so that creates this pious behavior where they're a little too tight-fisted with their finances. They're driving their financial life with a really tight grip on the steering wheel, when maybe a more relaxed and looser grip would actually be more comfortable for them and help them drive a little bit more skillfully. All right, so that's a quick overview of the money monsters. Now let's jump into the enlightenment structure for a type 1. So how do we get over all this? Now, if you want much more detailed information, please check out my book, Taming Your Money Monster. But again, this is just a quick overview. So the first thing you have in your enlightenment structure for a type 1 that gets you into that second half of life, you have a spiritual trap door. And this trap door can fall in anywhere. I've put it there because it's the only place that really fits on the graph. But you have a faux virtue, or a fake virtue is what faux means, meaning that it's a virtue for other types, and it's still a virtue in the ultimate sense of the word. But for you, it can be used to justify your worst, to justify your ego addictions and your worst tendencies. And so that's honesty for a 1. So when a 1 is being a little bit too honest, right, they're being maybe perhaps a little too critical of people around them and using honesty. Well, I'm not being critical. I'm not being judgmental. I'm not condemning you. I'm just being honest, right? I'm just telling you the truth, and as I see it. And to you, it is the truth, and it even is in fact true. But it isn't necessarily loving in the way that you're presenting it to the world. That you're doing this truth telling. If you're doing the truth telling with anger and resentment, that's the sign that you're using your faux virtue as that spiritual trapdoor. So you can avoid that pitfall. Now we're going to jump into your primary recovery virtue, which for a type 1 is gratitude. So having a daily gratitude practice is critical for type 1s, because that's the antidote to all that resentment that you're sitting on top of. The more you can be grateful for things as they are, for all the blessings in your life, think of it like this. How grateful are you to a young child who's first learning to walk? If it's, say, your son or daughter, your grandchild, like you feel love and gratitude for the existence of that being, even though they can't really walk very well. The flaw, their imperfection in their ability to walk is part of the beauty, and being able to see that kind of the beauty in the dark and the light of life, the shadow, like a master painter, right? It's like you got to see all of it, accept all of it, and be at peace with it in a way without all this anger and resentment that builds up inside of you when things aren't going to your idea of how perfect things could be, not the higher macro level of what perfection might look like. So when you get to gratitude, that's going to help you overcome that. And the more you practice gratitude, that begins to open up your secondary recovery virtue, which is mindfulness. Now, mindfulness is the primary recovery virtue for a type 7, and what that means is you start to look a little bit more like a healthy type 7 when you're practicing mindfulness. It means you're more in the present moment. You're more at peace and kind of calm with what is as it is right here and now, and not so much all about what could we do next to like fix things and make things better. And now these two, your primary and secondary recovery virtues, those are sort of like your more minor virtues, if you will, or the two smaller virtues that combine to make your super virtue or your highest virtue, or what I call your greatest virtue, which is serenity. So when you mix gratitude and mindfulness, that's how you get to serenity, which is ultimately going to cure the anger for a type 1 and begin to heal that sacred wound and allow you to live more fully in your enlightenment structure and in more happiness and joy and more peace in life. And only when you can tap into that serenity, that real calm about seeing yourself in loving connection with everyone and everything, and including yourself in that connection to whatever you want to call your sense of the divine or sacred, then the more you're going to be able to experience your greatest hope, which is to experience your complete goodness. You'll finally feel, know, understand, and appreciate your complete goodness when you're really living, even just, again, it's hard to live in this state all the time, but if you can catch glimpses of it in your meditation life, in your prayer life, or whatever your spiritual practice is, then the more that seeps into other parts of your life. And the thing that's funny about the Enneagram is that the more you can live in serenity, the less suffering you're going to have in life, because most of your adult life suffering is self-created. It's created by your shadow. You're creating all these problems with your ego addictions. And you're not just causing suffering for yourself, you're causing suffering for the people around you that you love. And so when you finally find that serenity, that's where you're going to get that complete goodness that you feel, and then you begin to heal that sacred wound. Then you have your sacred gift, which is my revision of the holy ideas. And the sacred gift for you is divine perfection. And a friend of mine just told me this today. He said, he's a type 1. He said, when he had a moment, he said, this moment is as perfect as it can be. And what he meant, and he was telling the story about when he was stuck in rush hour traffic and was just, he was getting angry and frustrated, and there, horns were honking, and he was in this really difficult situation where he found his anger rising. And when he be able to realize that this moment is as perfect as it can be, then he could relax a little bit. There's not, stop gripping the steering wheel so hard. What are you going to do about the traffic except just kick back and put on a podcast? So in that state, right, it's that when ones can find that divine perfection in every moment they're in, and find that divine perfection first and foremost inside themselves, that's beyond judgment, that's beyond criticism, that's just love and acceptance, like a parent loves a child, right? You got your issues and you got some growing to do, and you're going to make mistakes, but there's that eternal love that you can feel inside yourself, for your eternal essence, and that's always going to be completely good, right? That's your fractal piece of the divine that you're always connected to. And when you tap into that divine perfection inside yourself, you begin to see it more in others, and you help others to experience it as well. It's the gift you bring to the world, is to help everyone see the beauty, the love, the awe, the wonder, the perfection in the world we have, even with the shadows. It's the light and the dark, right, that have to mix together to see anything. And so that's why they're there, and I've oversimplified a deep philosophical and theological concept there, of course. Forgive the triteness of that statement, but it's true nonetheless. And then we get to the money master for our type 1, which is the poised, where you're not anxious about your earning, saving, investing, or giving. You're not avoidant about any of those things either. You've got your ducks in a row, but you know that life is not a perfect balance sheet. When something comes in and knocks your budget off course, you don't hit the roof. You're able to take it with a kind of equipoise and that serenity that you've really developed inside yourself, so that then when you do go out into the world, and you're always going to be that improver, right? That's not going away. But now when you're improving the world around you and improving yourself, you're doing it without anger. You're doing it without resentment. And you're going to be much more effective that way. You're going to be much able to bring that love to the world that we're all called to bring. And if you have money in your pocket, then you've got even a bigger crack in the world that you can heal. So the point of becoming a money master, or taming these money monsters, isn't just for self-aggrandizement. We're not trying to build up our ego in this process. We're trying to reduce our ego, or I would say I think that's an unfair way of looking at it. It's perhaps more like having the healthiest version of your ego, because you still need that ego to drive around in. You want the healthiest expression of that type, of your Enneagram type. And then when you've got money in your pocket, wow, look at all the good and love and compassion you can bring to a suffering and broken world. So that brings you to your money master. I hope this gave you a good insight to Enneagram Type 1s. And again, if you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share, and check out my new book. Talk to you soon.